All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started because it is 8:01. So I'm at my self-imposed nervous vamping threshold. Welcome, everyone, to Why Should I Visit webinar for June, which this month is all about Lisbon in Portugal. And buckle up. This one's going to be a little bit more history intensive than maybe some of the ones in the past because I think Portuguese history is kind of interesting and also something that we tend to get almost none of in our sort of school here in the US. And I think it's super relevant to enjoying Lisbon and the rest of Portugal. So before I get things started, just my general reminders. I am recording this. You're not being recorded. I can't see you. I can't hear you. As long as you don't type in the chat box, I don't even know you're there. So feel free to put this on your screen and sit back and enjoy yourself. And as the presentation goes along, if you think of questions you'd like answered, just pop them in the Q&A widget, which is sort of down at the bottom somewhere. And then at the end, I'll go through those. Don't worry about like, well, maybe you're going to talk about that. I'll wait to ask it. Just like if you think of something, throw it in there. And if I've already answered it, I will not answer it again, or maybe I will if it's a good question. Other than that, let's see, general stuff. These recordings I usually get posted the next day. So if you have to jump out and are desperate to know about like logistics in Lisbon, they're posted on whyshouldIvisit.com the next day. And if you're not already signed up for the newsletter, I don't know how you ended up here, but just go to whyshouldIvisit.com and click on newsletter and sign up. And once a month, I'll email you about general travel stuff. And then this month I tried just sending a reminder a couple of days in advance of the webinar because I know the Zoom registration thing is a little confusing and it is what it is. So I hope that's okay. I promise no more than that. I'm not going to turn this into a regular thing. So let's talk about Lisbon. And we will start things out the way I usually start things out with a map because yeah, I would bet a lot of people couldn't, pinpoint Lisbon on a map. So Portugal, which you may be a little more familiar with, is on the western coast of Spain. It's a very tall, narrow country, which sort of is going to come back again and again as we talk about a trip to sort of Lisbon and Portugal, when we talk about why I think it's such a great place to go visit. And Lisbon is sort of down here in the purple box on the left, and then on the right, you see a blow up of the Lisbon area. One of the things that's, I think, important to understand and maybe a little surprising for people going to Lisbon, especially if you're sort of vaguely familiar with Portuguese sort of age of exploration history, is Lisbon itself is not sort of facing the Atlantic Ocean. It's on this estuary. And there's actually a really big bridge that looks just like the Golden Gate Bridge because they bought a copy of it right in Lisbon. But like the heart of Lisbon sort of faces into the estuary. And that is sort of not where the age of exploration ships would have sailed from. And so that's, I think, important to understand if you're expecting it to be sort of edge of the earth facing off into the nothingness of the Atlantic Ocean. That's very much not Lisbon. It is beyond just the San Francisco connection with the Golden Gate Bridge. It is very much like sort of being in much of San Francisco where you sort of face into the bay. You can sort of see here, if you flip this map upside down, it would look an awful lot like sort of San Francisco and Oakland and all that. So that's the general sort of geographic placement of it. We're going to dive into some more detailed maps of Lisbon in a moment and talk about some day trips out from here as well. So the general agenda for tonight, as per every month, is I'm going to do a bit of sort of high-level proselytizing about why you'll love Lisbon. Then I'm going to talk about what you do on a trip to Lisbon. And again, this one's going to get a little bit more into history, and I'm sort of just shoving it into that what you'll do framework. We'll talk a little bit of logistics about what a broader trip to Portugal might look like. And then at the end, question and answer. So why are you going to love Lisbon? So I think Lisbon, first off, is the gateway to Portugal. And it's the place, if you're coming for a trip to Portugal, you're probably going to start out in Lisbon. You should start out in Lisbon. I really think you should start out in Lisbon. And so now allow me to sort of talk a little bit. Portugal, least visited country in Western Europe. And for a long time, it was like the least visited, like really not visited, right? That started changing really sort of from 2015 up through the start of the pandemic. Tourism growth was pretty high. They'd started getting more cruise traffic coming in. You'd sort of do a cruise that maybe started in Lisbon or started in Italy and sort of bounced along the Med and ended in Lisbon. So they started getting some more of that, which did start to sort of influence the city a little bit, but a far cry from Venice, Amsterdam, Paris, et cetera, in terms of tourism. But you can definitely feel that it's a city that's changing as more tourists come in, and the country in general is starting to adapt to that. And in general, the country is a country, and what we're going to talk about, the history, it's still sort of growing and changing quite a bit as it figures out its place within the European Union, within Western Europe. And so that's an exciting place to come. And I think my overall frame for my conversation with you tonight is, I think Lisbon is a really, really great introduction to Europe, even if you've never been to Europe before. And it's increasingly becoming the place where if, a couple with a couple like, tween kids said, we want to go to Europe, where should we go? I would say, like, spend some time in Lisbon, explore Portugal. And I'm going to make a case for that in a few ways. First off, it's sort of a microcosm of everything you'd want out of a great European city, without being sort of overwhelming, being totally sort of mass tourism, being really expensive, especially if you're trying to travel with the whole family. So it gives you, cathedrals, certain palaces, monasteries, great museums, great food, cool day trips, cool history, sort of all of that packed into a really manageable city at, a 20% discount to the rest of Europe. And then you can hop in a car and explore the rest of Portugal and sort of chart your own path. And you've got this like nice compact country. You could drive end to end in one day if you wanted to, no problem. So very accessible. So unless you are sort of approaching Europe with this, like, I must see the David on my first trip to Europe, which some people do. Some people, like, they've dreamed their whole life of seeing the Eiffel Tower. Well, it's only in one place. You're going to have to go to Paris. But if your goal is to sort of introduce some folks to what you love about Europe, what's great about Europe, Lisbon is a really great option. And I think it's going to sort of create some lasting memories in the ways that, maybe going to a real tourist hotbed, might create a little bit more tension and whatnot. So we're going to circle back on that a few times. You'll hear me hammering that point home. Yes, these webinars are turning very preachy. Welcome to me. It's also point number two of coming to Lisbon is it is the entry point into this amazing Portuguese history, which is certainly problematic in many parts, but is also sort of very unique within Western Europe. And so again, if you're pretty familiar with French history, pretty familiar maybe with Italian history and Renaissance history, I can almost guarantee that nowhere in your history books did it say, meanwhile, in Portugal, if anything, you maybe got mention of like Vasco da Gama, setting off, doing some exploration stuff, and somehow they ended up with Brazil, right? But you're very unlikely to have gotten a deep read on Portuguese history. And Lisbon is the place where you're going to do that. It's where you're going to sort of see the sites and go to the museums and learn that history and experience that history. I found this on the web. And my watch found that on the web. And I think even more interesting is that the sort of Lisbon wears its history on its sleeve. And so as you explore the city, even when you're not in a museum, if you've sort of done your homework, and we'll talk about that in a moment, you're going to see that history sort of baked into the fabric of the city in a way that I think is really, really fascinating. And finally, I got to have food, but really this is more than just the food. But I think Portuguese food gets kind of short shrift. People think it's just dried cod, and there's a lot of dried cod. We'll talk about that. But more than that, Portugal is this sort of small country that still manages to have all of these microcultures, and Lisbon sort of reflects that. And so the food is actually very, very diverse. And you can find in Portugal everything from sort of very traditional peasant food, which is what a lot of the Portuguese food historically was. You'll also find some of the most diverse pastries and baked goods in all of Europe, which would probably surprise you. And then reflecting the sort of breadth of the regions within Portugal and all of these different microcultures, you find, just really fascinating diversity in the food. So I think it's a really interesting food scene, and especially if you then get out and explore Portugal more fully, you'll see that as well. So it'll surprise you. So, what would a trip to Lisbon look like, and what are you going to do on that trip? As I said, we're not going to dive right into what you're going to do, because before you do stuff, you should pre-do some stuff. You should do a little homework. And I would recommend reading a book on Portuguese history. This is a book that I've read on Portuguese history that I thought actually did a pretty good job of sort of covering that age of exploration history. And it was a really compelling read. And I think one of the things you'll find if you go and seek out a Portuguese history from the Romans onward is those tend to be a little dry. So if you pick an era that's maybe a little more interesting to you in general, so whether that's, we're going to talk about all of these, but the age of exploration or the Reconquista or the Moorish period, go and pick a book on that just to sort of dive into some of that history. And one of the things you'll also start to pick up on is how much influence the Portuguese have had around the world. And you'll then start to notice those things when you're traveling in other places. And I'll point a few of those things out as we go through this going forward. So read a book. This one I can recommend as a good read that I think did a good job of sort of dealing with the subject matter at hand, and definitely something worth taking a look at. So we're not going to do a full history lesson here, but I wanted to just sort of set some things in order for you, because we're going to be referring back to a few of these things as we look at some of the sites within Lisbon. So very briefly, Portuguese history. Portuguese history doesn't start with the Romans, of course. It goes way, way, way back, but you'll see remnants of the Romans. So you have Romans, then you have the Germanic tribes come in as the Romans are sort of collapsing. And then sort of first big moment in Portuguese history that's going to impact your trip is the Moorish invasion coming up from North Africa, right? And so they seize all of Andalusia, and so Portugal, Spain, parts of France, for roughly 500 years, and almost immediately, as soon as that starts, you have the Reconquista as the other European powers and the church are trying to reclaim the land, right? And that influences a lot of the Portuguese history from that era, obviously. I should note, you might be saying like, well, actually the Moors were still in Granada up through the late 15th century. But by the mid 1250 or so, Portugal was sort of the borders that it is today. And that's actually a good trivia fact for you, which is the border between Portugal and Spain is the longest unchanging, or it is the border in Europe that has been unchanged for the longest amount of time. How about that? So almost 800 years roughly, that border has remained fixed. So you have that. You have the sort of start of what the Portuguese consider modern Portugal. So when they talk about their history, it's sort of starting in 1250 with the rise of some kings and things like that. But then the thing that really takes the Portuguese and catapults them into world power is the age of exploration, where the Portuguese become the world leaders in sailing technology and a variety of other technologies for navigation. And they develop this globe-spanning trading empire. Obviously seizing Brazil, deal with the Spanish and the Catholic Church, and then developing sort of trading outposts all along the coast of Africa, all along the coast of India, over to the Malacca Straits, and then over to both Indonesia and up to China, seizing Macau, and then up into southern Japan as well. And so this huge trading empire that really does, span the globe. Also, here's what I found. I'm gonna have to take my watch off. Also seized Angola and Mozambique, which were both Portuguese. So you have that. And then in around the 1580s, a king dies and some other people get grumpy about that. And you have a bunch of, I'm not really into royal history, but a bunch of royals are fighting. and they get distracted from running a big trading empire. And so the whole thing sort of crumbles. And obviously a bunch of other European powers are coming on steam at that point. And Portugal sort of just collapses in terms of its relevance to the rest of the world. And that's sort of where it is from the 1580s, you could argue, to today. Portuguese probably wouldn't say that, but the other important events in Portuguese history are that in 1755, there is this massive earthquake that hits Lisbon. And we'll see in a minute, destroys big chunks of Lisbon. And then there is this guy who's sort of prime minister, and he says, everything's broken and only I can fix it. And so he becomes a dictator. His name Pombalene, rebuilds the city, also is a dictator and does a lot of other bad things. But the city you see today is sort of, it's the summation of this very, very old history, this history of invasion, this history of being the world power and exploration, and then that crumbling, and then the whole city literally crumbling, and then getting rebuilt by a dictator guy. And then finally, in the 20th century, Portugal's a dictatorship from 1933 to 1974 under Salazar, who dies in 1970, and then the dictatorship sort of peters out. But so the last thing I'll give you on this slide, which I know I've been on for a very long time, is if you are the type of person, if you are a person who can handle watching Anthony Bourdain shows, which I still struggle with, his show from Parts Unknown about Lisbon does a really good job of getting into that last point, the history of a dictatorship, and talking to people about living under Salazar and how it still influences the culture today, and what it's like to sort of guard your words because you never know who's going to get disappeared, and how it sort of influences Portuguese culture into the modern day. So again, I think I wanted to touch on these points because I think for a lot of us growing up in a very stripped down American version of European history, you might be hard pressed to recognize that there were like dictatorships in Western Europe in the 70s. So that's my last history lesson point for today. It's all pictures and fun time from here on, I promise. But as I said, Lisbon wears its history on its sleeve. So as you walk around, you will come across things like the Church of the Carmo Church, which was destroyed in that 1755 earthquake and is still destroyed. You can walk into it. It's basically an emptied out shell, but you can see the cracks and the scars from that earthquake because in 1755, they decided that it was important to sort of preserve it in this state as a commemoration of that event. The earthquake happened on Easter Sunday in the morning, so everyone was in church. There were many deaths, many fires, etc. And they left this church as it is. So you're going to sort of see that. And then, of course, as you explore the city, you're going to see the remnants of what happens when big swaths of a city are destroyed and then rebuilt by a dictator, which is you get these big dictatorial thoroughfares. You get, big squares and, wide boulevards. And, obviously these buildings are not from the 1750s. These are more modern, but built under a different dictator. All dictators sort of do terrible architecture. And so you're going to see that on the sort of fabric of the city as well as you explore it. You'll go from this like super claustrophobic Roman twisty neighborhood into this wide open, designed to be intimidating, to keep you in your place, dictatorial architecture within a few blocks. And then if you explore a little further, what you're going to find is this entire style of architecture unique to Portugal called Manueline, which is sort of very somewhat overwrought, but specifically designed to pull in the influences of their age of empire, which is like the ceiling, for example, is designed to evoke all of the knots and the ropes of sailing vessels all woven together. And then all of the carvings, and we're going to talk more about this building in a minute, all the carvings are evoking the creatures and the people of these places that the Portuguese were out exploring in the 15th and 16th century. So this entire unique style of architecture that was developed in response to that event. And you're not going to see it just in, a church, but you see it throughout the city on palaces, churches, fancy homes, etc. So that's a sort of teaser of the history. Now let's look a little more closely at what these different neighborhoods actually are within Portugal. And you'll see them highlighted in different colors here, thanks to Lisbon.net. I didn't have to make this map. So the big open dictatorial area that we were just looking at is this area in pink going down here. And the dictator was Pombalin. It's the Pombal neighborhood, essentially. And it sort of goes down to the Baixa, which again was an area right on the waterfront that was totally leveled by the earthquake. Some of it was backfilled as well to create some new land. But this whole swath of the city is sort of that more modern by European standards, sort of dictatorial aesthetic, designed to be a little intimidating, to dwarf you a little bit. But the Baixa today is really, I mean, it is the center of the city, right? There's a big square, which is where you're going to have, events and protests and anything else, right, in the Baixa. On either side of those sort of more modern areas, though, you have the Barrio Alto and the Alfama. And both of these are neighborhoods that were more or less spared by the earthquake because they're on hills and yada, yada, yada. They're made of rocks that, I don't know, didn't fall down a lot, whatever. No one cares about that. Hi, Cat. And these are, I think, probably the two sort of really evocative neighborhoods for tourists coming to Lisbon. So the Alfama is this really, really old neighborhood of twists and turns and tiny little alleys. It, to me, feels kind of like Naples in a lot of ways. Again, very similar history, actually, if you sort of think about it. And this is where you're going to really get into some of the most authentic sort of Lisbon culture as you explore the Alfama. The Barrio Alta is a little bit more trendy. It's where some of the more hip restaurants are. There's also some really great places to stay there. It's a little bit more open. So the Alfama, big swaths of it, like a car couldn't fit in. Barrio Alta is maybe a little more open. Still a lot of it you shouldn't take a car in, maybe a Renault Twizy or something. But both of those are neighborhoods as tourists you're going to want to be keeping your eye on. And then we're going to be looking at Belem, which is almost a suburb of Lisbon, but you can sort of take a tram car to it. Just takes a few minutes. And that's an area where it again was safe during the earthquake, and was both historically a place where there's a lot of sort of age of exploration connections that we'll look at. And then after the earthquake, anyone who could afford to moved out to Belem because, again, it was perceived as the safest place if there was another earthquake. So it's got a lot of really fancy houses and stuff. And just in terms of walkability, we'll talk about transit at the end. Getting around the city is really easy, but it's also a very, very walkable city, especially within this region. You could certainly walk out to Belem if you really wanted to, but it's fun to ride the trolley car. You've heard me say it before. I will say it again. Guided tours are a really great investment, a great way to get someone to show you around a city, whether it's a food tour or a history tour or whatever you're into tour. Hiring someone for a couple hours to be your friend and to show you around their city and to be able to ask them questions is the best investment you can make as a tourist. Ideally, like, book it the day after you land so that you can ask them all kinds of tips about, like, hey, what's happening this weekend? Not what are the top 10 sites from TripAdvisor, but what's happening this weekend that, I will have missed if I didn't ask you about it, because I would have no way of knowing about it otherwise. So guided tours are a great investment. But if for whatever reason you don't want to do a guided tour, or maybe you've done a guided tour and you want to learn even more, I thought this would be a good chance for me to encourage you to go download the Rick Steves Audio Europe application, which is a free application for iOS and Android. It's just Google Rick or search Rick Steves within your respective app store. Because what this does is it has free tours of all over Europe. And what it is it's Rick and usually a local guide, and they're taking you on a tour. So they're going to tell you what to look at. They're going to tell you where to walk. They're going to make really silly jokes as they go. And that's a great way to experience a tour. I think he has 3 or 4 different audio tours just of Lisbon. They're usually about an hour, and they're designed to be done on foot, sort of at a self-guided pace. You can always pause them if you need to. And the app also has all of the sort of interviews from his radio show / podcast recategorized by location. So you can go in and say, I want to, every time he's talked to a guest about Lisbon, let me just look at those interviews and you can listen to those. And you can download all of this stuff in advance so you don't need connectivity on your phone while you're in Europe. And the last tip I'll give you on this, if you're an iPhone user and you're traveling with your partner and you both have AirPods, one tip you might not know about is that with newer versions of iOS, you can have a guest AirPod. So you can connect two sets of AirPods to one phone just by opening the lid while the phone is unlocked. And it'll say, do you want to share your audio? And so you can actually walk around, keep your phone in your pocket, just both of you keep your AirPods in your ears, and you're going to get a nice synchronized tour without having to deal with extension cords and splitters and all of that. And I think that's just super fun. If you're, really, really hip and fashionable, you could have a little hat to cover your AirPods, and then you'll just look like you know everything you're doing. You're walking with confidence. Anyways, that's not me. So walking around Lisbon, you're going to want to get your walking feet on. You're going to want to get your walking calves on, because Lisbon is a pretty hilly city. You're going to be going up and down a lot. You can see here, this is a picture of just, from an overlook in the city, and it's a pretty steep drop off down to the neighborhood below you. So lots of hills, be ready for that. I'd also note here, you've got this real mix in this city of graffiti. This is not like really off the beaten path. There's, a mix of graffiti and beautiful architecture. It's a city that's still developing. Again, it reminds me in a lot of ways of Naples. It's still got a grittiness to it, reflecting the fact that Portugal, up until very, very recently, was a very poor country. And Lisbon is only now sort of really being revitalized. Luckily, if you don't love hills, Lisbon also has a number of elevators. And these are a really cool feature of Lisbon. And you'll actually stumble upon these. There's a few of them around the city. This one is the Santa Justa elevator. And you might guess that the person who built it was a big fan of Mr. Eiffel. And the way these work is at street level, you walk into the elevator. It's obviously a very wrought iron classic elevator. It then takes you up to the landing deck up here, which obviously has a great view. And then what you can't see in this photo is coming out the back of it at this level is a walkway. And then that walkway continues back until it meets the hillside. So there's sort of a hill going up here, and you're going straight up and then straight over, and you get to avoid walking up that hill. And so there's a number of these around Lisbon that let you shortcut those hills when you're out walking. And so you can sort of put those into your map, or if you're a fan of a paper map like I am, maybe make some marks on those so that if you are plotting your course and want to avoid a hill, you just take the elevator. They're also really fun, and obviously you get a great view as well. And they're a pretty unique feature of Lisbon. Another thing you're going to want to keep an eye out as you're exploring Lisbon, you're going to want to keep an eye out on for two reasons. One, all throughout Lisbon, everywhere you're going to go, you're going to see these black and white stone or cobbles, essentially. And there are lots and lots of different patterns for them. You see a pretty complex pattern on the right. There's actually an official book of all of the patterns that are allowed to be done, so that even when they build a new road or a new sidewalk, they're recreating these patterns, the approved historic patterns. One of the things that I sort of mentioned, you start to see Portuguese influence show up elsewhere. You will see these paving patterns, or these stone patterns, in places like Brazil, in places like Macau, anywhere the Portuguese were, they took this style, and you'll see these pop up. And occasionally I've definitely been in cities that I wasn't fully read up on the history in, and you see this and you're like, I bet the Portuguese were here. And then you go looking, and of course they had a trading outpost or something. The other reason you want to keep an eye on these, though, is that Lisbon is not an especially accessibility or mobility friendly city. And so on the left here, what you'll see is you've got this sort of paving, you've got this white line running through it. It's maybe a little hard to see in the photo, but this is essentially a curb here that falls off at an angle. And so essentially you've got a really uneven surface, right? It's uneven because it's a hilly town that went through a really big earthquake. And then it's uneven because these are hand laid, maybe hundreds of years ago. And then you've got this sort of arcing curb down to the street, and then it sort of curves back up because they're designed to funnel water around. And so One, if you're just a fully mobile person and you're not paying attention to what you're doing, it's very easy to trip and fall in Lisbon. And if you're someone who's walking with the assistance of a cane, or you're trying to get around in a wheelchair or something like that, Lisbon could be a pretty tough city to navigate. So definitely keep that in mind as you're planning a trip. I did want to sort of give that warning because especially like in the rain, it can be a fairly treacherous place. But really cool thing to keep an eye out for. And it does feel like once you're read into the secret club of noticing Portuguese paving, it's really fun to notice it everywhere else you go as well. You're also going to find wandering around Lisbon that it is packed with these amazingly narrow, super upright lanes. These are both pictures from the Alfama, which is that really old neighborhood to the sort of west of the newer area. And again, to me, this just reminds me so much of Naples. And for a similar reason, which is, again, if you sort of believe the historic anecdotes the Portuguese tell, these were designed this way in order to dissuade pirates, right? You're right on the water. Pirates are coming up from the Med, or maybe coming up off the coast of Africa. They're coming to raid your city. Well, they say that intentionally these streets are super curvy and confusing and double back on themselves so that invaders wouldn't be able to find their way through and potentially wouldn't be able to find their way back out. The reality is probably that, these are sort of based on desire paths, and these are where animals walked in, 1,000 years BC when it was the Carthaginians or whatever, and eventually they became streets. But either way, take it or leave it. The other thing you're going to find as you wander these streets is Lisbon, along with only a handful of other cities that I've been in, is a city that like totally changes its character depending on the time of day and the day of the week. And so you need to explore at all times of day and all days of the week to really get a full sense of it. I had this experience that, we were staying in a neighborhood and there was a street next to us, and you'd walk down it and every door is sort of metal shutters, or maybe, a dude out, welding or something on the street. And you think, wow, this is sort of still a poor city. These are abandoned buildings, whatever. And then happened to be there at like 10 p.m. on a Friday. And it turns out like every one of those places was a really cool restaurant or bar, but they just only opened for like a few hours, a few days a week or something. And suddenly this is a thriving, vibrant street full of, people having a great time, but there's no external signage or anything like that. And so you can walk down a street like this one on the left, you might walk down that and think, oh, it's just a quiet, maybe these are just apartments or something. You could come back 8 hours later and find every one of these is a bar or restaurant spilling out on the street full of people. So it really does behoove you to get out and explore different times of the day. This neighborhood of the Alfama is also where you're going to experience, if you're interested, the music of Portugal, fado, which is, you may have heard it. It is sort of music usually sung by women, and it sounds like they're very, very sad because their husband of 40 years has just died in an accident at sea. Sounds like that because that's basically what all the songs are about. It's this very mournful, music that, is sort of like clawing with sadness, usually with a single, so it's a woman singing, usually with a single man accompanying her on guitar. There is some more upbeat stuff and other topics, but that's generally the topic. And you'll find it all throughout Portugal, but especially in Lisbon, especially in the Alfama, where you're going to find the really authentic bars that have someone playing fado. And it's not the kind of thing where you're going to go find a schedule posted on the web. It's, hey, it's Thursday night and some people are doing fado in this bar. If you want something a little more predictable, there is also a fado museum in Lisbon that has like a museum bar attached where you can have fado performances by really great fado performers, right? This isn't like the Chuck E. Cheese band. But if you want something a little more predictable, that's a great option as well. And that's also going to give you, especially for a non-Portuguese speaker, a way to sort of see translations of the music and understand the history of the music and the instruments and all of that as well. So fado is the other thing you're going to look for in these very windy old neighborhoods. As you explore the city, you're also going to probably notice that there's a giant castle overlooking it. It's hard to miss. And this is the Castle of St. George. It's up on the hilltop. This was built around the end of the Reconquista in the 13th century, but there's been some sort of military structure on this hill going back to the Roman times and likely further, because it's a really good place to put a military establishment, right? So it's fun to have this as a point of reference because you can see it from most of the city. So as you're trying to get your orientation, that's really helpful. You can go up there and go up to the overlook, and it's a great view of the city. I would say you don't need to pay to get inside because inside is just some rusty cannons and not a whole lot else. But it's a great location to go up to, a great place to overlook. We're going to talk about a much more fun castle to explore in just a minute, though. I did make the case that I think that Lisbon is a great entry point into Europe if you're trying to introduce someone to Europe. And to me, one of the things that makes Europe magical is going to a really great museum and seeing really amazing artwork, right? And in Lisbon, because everything in Lisbon is at Portuguese scale, what they have is the Golbankian Museum. Now, this is very different from the Uffizi or the Prado or the Louvre, because this was a guy's private collection. Golbankian, Mr. Golbankian, I can't remember his first name. He was a massive art collector, collected art from all around the world, and then decided to make a museum with his art. And so he collected sort of lots and lots of European masters, Renoir and Rembrandt and Monet and all of that, as well as a really amazing jewelry collection and a bunch of sort of older sort of Roman artifacts and a handful of things from elsewhere in the world as well. But it's actually, I think, a really great museum because it's sort of stripped back, as I say, it's sort of Portuguese scale. And so it's not overwhelming in the way that, if you've never been to a sort of great art museum and you set foot in the Prado, I don't know, that can be pretty stressful if you feel like you need to see all of it. You're gonna be rushing through those galleries. Whereas in the Golbankian, you can budget 3 hours to be there, and you can actually really engage with all of the work and have a really enjoyable time. And it's super well curated to introduce you to all of the sort of high points of Western art in a very addressable, accessible way. So the Golbankian, again, when you're putting together your "this is what Europe is like" trip, you've got castles, and we're going to talk about churches in a minute, and you've got great art. I think just keep Lisbon on the list. Just to look at the map again, the Golbankian that we were just looking at is up in this newer area in the sort of northern part of the pink. It's actually maybe a little bit further up. But now I want to take you out to Belem. As I said, you can get to Belem by hopping on a trolley, which is really, really fun. There's lots of other options for getting to Belem as well. And in Belem, what you're going to find is a bunch of really cool architecture and history related to the Age of Exploration. Because essentially, in the 15th century, there had been what I imagine as essentially a shack where all the sailors went to pray before they set out on their world voyages. So there's a port there, ships would anchor there. There was this sort of little sailors chapel, they would go pray. And I'm not sure when that sort of started, but it was in full swing by the time the Age of Exploration was going. And so then Portugal starts to reap the benefits of their exploration. And King Manuel decides to replace that little shack with a massive monastery and church. And you see it here. And this is where we start to get that Manueline art, which is this art that is sort of influenced by the sort of exploration and sea travel, sea voyages. And so this is a really massive structure that you can go and explore. But also alongside it is a museum of the history of exploration, which is where you'll see models that explain why the Portuguese ships were so great. You'll get an understanding of all of the technology that the Portuguese invented in order to be able to do these voyages in terms of navigation and food storage, and how they made their ships so fast and so reliable and all of these things. So a really great museum around that. You'll also, if this is your thing, there's a museum right next door, which is the Museum of the sort of royal carriages. So all of these royal carriages going back to the 15th century up through the end of the the kings and queens in the 19th century. So that's a fun place if you're really into that sort of that side of the history. And there's also, Belem faces the water. There's also a couple structures, one modern and one not, that are sort of key in the sort of bookends of Portuguese exploration. So the very unfortunate sort of ugly brutalist structure on the left is the Monument of the Explorers, I believe it's called. And you can get a guide online that will explain who each of these people are. So Prince Henry the Navigator and Vasco da Gama and all of the different important explorers of Portugal. And then on the right, you have the Tower of Belem, and legend has it this was the structure that Portuguese sailors coming back from all around the world, this was the first thing they would cite that would let them know that they were for sure home, because they could see it from out at sea. It would have a fire burning, and that was how they knew they were home. And you can go in and tour it as well, and it's got some good history materials on sort of its placement within the estuary, the entry to the estuary. And it's also a good chance, depending on when you're there, to see how big the tidal changes in the estuary are, because sometimes you'll be there and this whole area will be total dry land, and sometimes you'll be and the tower is actually in the water. And this picture was sort of partway in between. So we've talked about museums and churches and exploration, all of that stuff. So you're getting your like micro doses of Europe. And finally, what we need to do is talk about food, because it's a way of life. This is bacalhau. So bacalhau is dried cod. So if you take cod, which they don't catch anymore because they caught it all, so they get it from the Scandinavians. I can't remember which Scandinavians sell them their cod nowadays. And they dry it in salt. And then they rehydrate it by soaking it in water for like 24 hours and then rinsing it and then soaking it in water for another 24 hours. And eventually it sort of turns back into something kind of like meat, kind of like fish, I should say. And then they turn it into all kinds of stuff. The Portuguese saying is that they have a different bacalhau recipe for every day of the year. And so, excuse me, this is a photo of Kat. Thanks, Kat, for letting me use this photo of you. And this is a bunch of dishes that are bacalhau based. So this is a rice dish with bacalhau mixed in, sort of just shredded. You'll get it in dumplings. You'll get it fried. You'll get all kinds of different bacalhau. So if you're really into bacalhau, great. And actually, I'll cop to it. I kind of like bacalhau. I think it's actually pretty good. Kat hates it, but I kind of enjoy it. So I'm happy to try all 365 ways to cook bacalhau. But if that's not your speed, the important thing to know is that Portuguese cuisine is super, super diverse, and you can get any of it in Lisbon. And so, for example, in a city that is a little further out of Lisbon called Évora, which is in a region called Alentejo on a sort of high desert plain, they raise these special pigs that they feed on acorns, and they're super, super great pigs. And there's a whole cuisine built around that. And of course, you can get that in Lisbon. Up in the north, you've got Porto, where port wine is from, and they're a very different climate. So they're growing all different vegetables and creating a totally different cuisine. And then you have this whole mix. And then nowadays, sort of from 2005-ish on, as Portugal was integrated into the European Union and switched to the euro and all of that, you had this new prosperity, which bred hipsters. And hipsters bring with them sort of experimentation in food. And the best place to go and enjoy that is this place called the Time Out Market. And that is the same Time Out that makes the guidebooks. I don't understand how they came to own a market in Lisbon. It confused me for a very long time. So they took what was the city food market, and there's still some food vendors sort of like grocery vegetables and things in the outskirts. But the heart of it is this food hall. And most of these are outposts of some of the trendiest, most high-end restaurants in Lisbon, making accessible food for people to come have for lunch or a casual dinner. You see all the seating is sort of communal tables, and you can go and get, again, like, a mix and match meal from some of the best chefs in Lisbon, all in this one place. And I think the food we had here was some of the best that I've had, anywhere really. And certainly this is one of the top food halls that I've been to anywhere in the world. And so Time Out Market, again, you might think, that seems a little commercial. Maybe I want to go somewhere more authentic. But actually, like if you want to go where the foodie Lisbon residents are coming to get awesome food for lunch or a casual dinner, Time Out Market, place to go. And then I can't wrap up the food section without talking about pastel de nata. But really, I want to use that as a jumping off point to talk about all the amazing pastries in Portugal. So pastel de nata, which you see on the right, it's sort of a puff pastry cup that's filled with an egg custard and then baked at a really, really high temperature so that it sort of gets those little burnt pockets. And then often it's sort of topped with powdered sugar or cinnamon. And they're eaten as a breakfast food. So you have your pastel de nata and your espresso for breakfast. And you'll find these all over Portugal, but they were invented in Belem. And the best ones, I think, are made in Belem still. There's a couple places that make really amazing pastel de nata, and they turn them out all day. So you can go and have a fresh one right out of the oven, just cool enough to sort of solidify, which is really a delightful treat. But the reason we have pastel de nata is also the reason that Portugal has such an amazing sort of pastry and dessert culture, which is you had all these villages, all these towns throughout Portugal. It's a lot of like farming communities. There's not a lot of interconnectivity, especially this is sort of from the 15th century onward. They're all doing their own thing. And many of them have sort of convents, right, with nuns. And one of the things that nuns need to do is they need to use egg whites to starch their clothes. What do you do with egg whites? I'm blanking on the term. Anyways, there's something with the clothes and the egg whites, right? The point is, there's a lot of nuns using up eggs and they're not using the egg yolks. So all over Portugal, you have this entire pastry culture built around what the heck do we do with all of these extra egg yolks? So in Lisbon, you got the pastel de nata, you got the puff pastry with the egg custard, right? Which, like when you make it at home and you see how many egg yolks you put into this, you'll understand. But you go to Coimbra, you go to any of these other cities within Portugal, and you're going to find them doing totally different baked goods using, again, those same core ingredients of like egg yolks, sugar, flour, not too much else, maybe some spices, but often not a lot of spices because after the exploration crumbled, they weren't getting a lot of it. And I think that's really fun. It's fun to see how the same ingredients made available for the same reasons get remixed and repurposed in all different ways around the country. And then of course, if you go into any of the bakeries within Lisbon, you're going to see, you'll see all these different pastries and you might see, oh, those people are from Evora. They're making totally different pastries in their bakery. So it's a last, again, you see, I'm very excited about food in Portugal. Finally, we're going to do a quick day trip and talk about one outing you can take from Lisbon, because I think everyone going to Lisbon probably goes out to Sintra. Sintra is a 20-minute train ride out of the city. And it is sort of, as we're doing our stereotypical crash course in Europe, it's going to tick all those last boxes for you, because when you get to Sintra, you'll see on the two hills, you'll see a really old castle and a really weird palace. And you can explore both of these and you'll finish your European experience. So first off, we go to the Moorish Castle, which is, it looks like a ruined castle, right? How cool, I can go explore this ruined castle. And technically, there was a castle there at some point. But in the 19th century, the early 19th century, there's this king named King Ferdinand, and he's living in that other palace that we'll talk about in a minute. He's looking at this hill and he sees like, maybe there's some like very ruiny ruins, right? Some little walls and stuff. And he says, what would be cool is to have a ruined castle there for me to look at. And so he went out and had some people build a ruined castle. This was never an actual castle. It was built as a ruin in 1816, which I just think is a hilarious story. And I also think it's one of those things that I would bet an awful lot of tourists come through here thinking that they're in an actual historic ruin. And I think the real story is actually way more interesting and way funnier. So that's the Moorish, these are heavy air quotes, the Moorish Castle. But that other palace that we were looking at is, that's called the Pina Palace. And it is this totally bonkers, again, early 19th century mishmash of structures and colors and shapes. And if you're starting to think, gosh, that looks like Disneyland, well, this castle was the inspiration for King Ludwig's castle in Germany, which then was directly the influence for the Disney castles at the Disney theme parks. So this is the sort of proto-Disney castle. And again, this is a place you can go and explore. It's got an awful lot of interesting exterior structures, and the interior as well is sort of as it was left when the monarchy fled at the end of the 19th century. So the last queen was living there, and then things sort of went sour for the monarchy, and they bailed out and left it. And so all the furniture of the monarchs is there, the sort of dinnerware, the phone system, all that stuff is as it was at the very end of the 19th century. Bell system, I should say, not phone system. And it was essentially immediately preserved, right? The Portuguese state taking over from the monarchs sort of kept it in this condition and turned it into a museum, essentially, that you can go tour. So it's a really interesting look at that part of the history. And it is also, as I say, a very bonkers place. And it has some amazing gardens that tumble all the way down the hill that it's on, with like castles built for ducks and the other things that you might do if you're the type of king that would build yourself a palace like this and then a ruin to look at. Whew. All right, quickly, logistics. And while I'm doing this, feel free to throw any questions you've got in the chat. So first, getting there and getting around. If you're thinking of doing a tour just of Portugal, I'd really encourage you to think about doing an open jaw tour, and that's where you fly into one city and fly out of another city. So it's very, very practical to fly into Lisbon and fly out of Porto. Unless you live in Boston or New York, you're almost certainly going to be connecting somewhere to get to Lisbon. So you may as well fly out of, Porto is a pretty big airport as well, but you can easily get from, both of these cities to Amsterdam and then back to the US or whatever. And so that way you can spend a few days in Lisbon, rent a car, go do an exploration trip of Portugal, end in Porto, do a couple of days in Porto. You can do a little sail up the river there, et cetera, and then fly out of Porto, and you don't have to come all the way back down. Up to you. Certainly look at the pricing. Sometimes the cost of a rental car one way is prohibitive and you have to go back to your original city. The city has some really great subway, trams, funiculars, the public transit's very, very accessible. And of course, you've always got your ride sharing services as well. So definitely don't use a car in Lisbon. Don't rent a car, I should say. But if you're going to do any exploration in Lisbon, outside of Lisbon, you have to get a car. There's really no feasible way to get around beyond that. And thanks to its sort of status as a very, very poor country in a very, very rich region, it has hugely benefited from European Union money. So it has the nicest highways in all of Europe. So getting from A to B in Portugal is very, very quick, very smooth, super easy. If you feel at all intimidated about driving in another country, like Portugal is a great place to do it because the roads are pretty quiet. They're meticulously maintained and constructed, super easy to navigate. Where should you stay? You can stay in hotels and Airbnbs and whatever, but if you're going to be in Portugal, I would beg you at least spend some time on the Pousada website. So what's a Pousada, you would ask? Basically, the Portuguese government said, well, we have a lot of sort of monumental architecture in this country because we used to be rich, but we're not rich anymore and we can't maintain it all. So we have castles and palaces and monasteries and military structures and all this stuff. And what they decided to do is they did a sort of partnership with a private company. I don't know what the specifics are, and turn them into hotels. And they are like gorgeous hotels built in these amazing historic structures. And when you're a guest there, you can go explore the whole place, like really explore the whole place. They have amazing food, really, really nice staff who are excited to show you around the grounds and the structures. And again, it's a chance to stay in a castle or an armory or any of these things. So there's one Pousada right in Lisbon and a few in the surrounding areas. And they're then scattered all throughout Portugal, including all of the sort of Portuguese outposts like in the Azores and elsewhere. So bookmark that website, spend some time dreaming about what it would be like to stay in some of these places. They're not crazy expensive. We ended up in one of them on a trip because it was the cheapest place to stay in Evora. And then when we got there, we said, we must be in the wrong place. This is too nice. And then we drove around for a while and came back and said, nope, this is the place we're staying. So yes, Poussadas.pt, check it out. Day-to-day navigating, you're going to want to learn some Portuguese, at least enough to say hello, thank you. You ask your basic questions. If you know Spanish, you'll be able to figure out a lot of stuff. You'll be able to read signs pretty well. You'll be able to understand stuff that's spoken, but don't assume that you can therefore just talk Spanish to people, because they kind of hate that. So learn enough Portuguese to be able to say, I don't speak Portuguese, do you speak Spanish? And then when they inevitably say yes, then you can talk Spanish, or you could ask for English first and then Spanish. Most of the older generation that grew up under Salazar are not going to speak English because he wasn't really pushing that. Then younger kids today, they're all learning English. And of course, anyone within the tourism sector is going to speak English. Lastly, consider the Lisbon Card. This is one of those magic tourist cards that most cities in Europe have now, where it gets you access to all of the sites. It gets you discounts on, tours and things, and it gets you access to all of their public transit, including like the train out to Sintra. And so if you're going to be in Lisbon for a few days and you're planning to do a lot of the sort of main sites and activities, the Lisbon card is actually a pretty good deal. A lot of these in some cities tend not to be such a great deal because they only they get you into all the sites except the ones you want to see. That's not the case with the Lisbon card. It really does cover pretty much everything you're going to want to do. And it's a pretty good deal. You can actually get it in advance as well if that makes you feel more comfortable. And then you show up like ready to go. And once you sort of use it for the first time, it starts working. So definitely consider that. And finally, further afield, if you're doing a trip of Portugal, I would strongly recommend checking out Évora. That's this sort of place in the high desert, Roman city, amazing Roman aqueduct and architecture there. Totally, totally different from Lisbon. Coimbra, home to the oldest university in Europe, I think from 1350, something like that. Very, very old. You can go explore that. It very much influenced sort of Harry Potter aesthetic, which is super fun. And then Porto in the north, sort of the second city, the working class city, industrial city, home of port wine, and the heart of this super rich agricultural area. So again, totally different. And then finally down in the south, if beaches are more your things, the whole Mediterranean coast of Portugal is called the Algarve. So if you want to go lie on like a sandy beach and enjoy that sort of life with a bunch of like British folks, because they're mostly the folks who are down there, you can go do that in the Algarve. Don't think that you're going to go to like the western coast of Portugal and hang out on a beach, because the Atlantic Ocean is real cold. So if you want to be in the water, you want to be down in the Algarve. Finally, thank you. So next month, sneak peek, we're going to be talking about Vilnius, which we just came back from. And that's going to be the sort of counterpoint to this like crash course in Lisbon, all in one city, or crash course in Europe, all in one city. Vilnius is sort of the other extreme of that. And I thought they'd go nicely together. And with that, I'll see if we've got any questions in the widget. And otherwise, if anyone else has questions, feel free to ask them. And otherwise, thanks so much for joining. Feel free to hop offline as well. I think you probably got the point that like Portugal's just a country you fall in love with, I think. And I don't think I could think of a negative thing to say about it. It's the kind of place, well, in fact, we just met someone who spent a couple of days in the Azores, which is Portuguese, and I think he fell in love with the same thing. And within a few days of being in the Azores, he talked to a real estate agent and bought a property. And I could totally understand how being in Portugal, you could think the same thing, because it's a really wonderful place to be. And I think Lisbon is a really killer city. So hope you enjoyed that. I hope it gets you excited for maybe putting Lisbon a little higher on your list. And yeah, thanks for joining. Oh, there's something popped up in the chat. Oh, cheers. Thanks, y'all. Have a great week. I'm gonna sign off because I don't know how to end these things. I guess I'll stop recording too. Stop recording.